Good afternoon, everybody. So this is not my usual time for coming live. You're used to seeing me on a Wednesday for lunchtime launch tips, but you're in for a treat this week because I have an amazing guest today, Janelle Aldred, who is an amazing comms consultant and broadcaster. I'm going to tell you more about her in a second and introduce you to her. I'm back with you on Wednesday for another live, but Janelle, it's so good to have you with me. Your experience is just exceptional.
Thank you, and it's so good to be with you. I love chatting with you, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation today.
Yeah, it's going to be so good. And we're talking about the topic of how to communicate like a pro on video. Now, everyone is using video, but you are a veteran broadcaster. And I think there's so much we can glean from your knowledge because you've literally been doing this for years. I just want to tell everybody, the scope of your experience and how rich it is. So you've been a news reader for the BBC, ITV, and ITN. You've worked in documentary. You have also run a TV channel as a channel controller, and you are now a comms controller, a comms consultant, writing your first book on comms. I mean, my God. And we have the privilege of having you here to talk about video. It's amazing.
No, I think it's so interesting because I made the decision, and it's funny, my whole life has been comms, you just read out, but then I didn't make my whole life comms, and now I've decided, okay, everything is about comms. It makes sense, and when you read that, I'm like, why didn't I think of that sooner?
Yeah, so I've got quite a few questions for you. Like I said, I think that your experience is so rich, so I want to get straight into it. With the first question, give us a little bit of your backstory about your journey in journalism and how kind of the industry is changed.
Oh my gosh. Well, I didn't grow up wanting to be a journalist, which is really odd because a lot of people do. They grow up, they're like, I want to be a journalist. All I've ever wanted to do. That was not my story. But I was always interested in the news, I was a weird child. I would read newspapers like age 7, 8, like a very strange child. And so I always kind of loved news, current affairs. I remember watching the very first thing that got me hooked randomly. We just got cable. It just come to the UK and my dad wanted to watch the cricket. So we got Sky News, and it was around the time of O.J. Simpson and the car chase. And I just remember watching this and being gripped and then seeing the trial all unfold on telly. We'd never seen that in the UK before. And I just found it fascinating. But then I didn't get to news. I went to journalism as a mature student and went straight from there to the BBC. And so from there, kind of the journey just unfolded. I think I didn't have a grand plan because it wasn't something I was trying to do. So, but the one thing that was very, that stuck with me was my tutor when I went for my kind of interview for the broadcast journalism course. You do a screen test and you do like a voice test. And she said to me, you're going to be a presenter. That is how you're going to make your money. You're going to be on the telly. And, I just believed her, which is really interesting. I just was like, okay. Because I was at that time looking for direction. So it was great to have someone say, okay, well, this is the direction.
Yeah.
So that's how I kind of entered. So that was well over a decade ago. And when I first started doing news, Instagram wasn't even invented.
Yeah.
So things have changed so much in terms of broadcasting. The changes that social media has brought to broadcasting have been absolutely vast. So yeah, there's been so much change, and a lot of it is down to technology.
Yeah, amazing. And so we've even seen in broadcasting the use of live streaming, like in recent years, which is incredible to just see how the two worlds have almost merged. But I think that there's something about being classically trained in a profession like you have that can never be replaced or eradicated. And for me, although kind of social media has democratized media, I think that there's still a place for the standards that were set in broadcast and seeing that more in the social media space. So as much as I love kind of the freedom of social media, I do also love that professionalism of broadcast, which you kind of have, which I love. So
it's interesting because we're trained in law, so we're trained how to not get sued essentially, and how to not libel people, and how to make sure that you're saying what should be said. And I think that obviously is bit what's missing sometimes from the democratized space, is that people just say anything. They say anything they want to say.
Yeah.
I think for me and a lot of people, and this is not about news, but for me, news's continued place in people's hearts and lives will only carry on if we hold true to those standards, which I think we're in a time where you see that slipping a bit and there's a bit of a loss of trust in news. And I think for us to continue to hold that space of trust, which is what sets us apart from everybody else in reality, because now anyone can grab a camera and film. But that for me is what will make news continue, and it's that integrity. And I think that's something that's really important that we don't talk about enough.
It's
so
super,
that's what we'll talk about today, but yeah.
it's super important. But just to talk about that, so obviously a lot of people here watching this will know that I'm a launch strategist, and when you launch something, media coverage is a big part of that. So while we're kind of on the topic, are there some do's and don'ts? Because it's very different to speak to, say, an audience like here on LinkedIn than it is to speaking to the media. Can you give us like a few things like that we need to consider?
So I think when it comes to getting press coverage, I think what a lot of people, a mistake that you see, people just want to talk to everyone. So people have one press release and they're like, I'm just going to just send it out to everybody. And I think the number one thing you can do is actually research where you're sending it, whose audience is actually aligned with the audience that you want to speak to. And I think a lot of people think, obviously, BBC, ITV, the big names, and it's great if you can get that coverage. But the reality of it is, or papers, the reality of it is your audience might not actually be there. Do you need to speak to them? Or actually, is there a more niche kind of outlet that would have a better return for you in terms of the time you're going to spend in the investment? And I think the other thing I actually do a course on getting organic press. But the other thing is
at some point at the end.
Yes, the other thing is, I think it's just people kind of go in with this not enough detail. Kind of say, oh, I've got this great event happening. Oh, well, so have lots of other people. And I think what people fail to remember is that although the media do need stories, there are far more people offering them stories than there are media outlets. So you have to think, how does my story actually stand out? And this is where the audience is important, because actually you might be pushing something that their audience is just not their audience, doesn't resonate. And if you watch different news channels, if you read different newspapers, different magazines, you can see that they're clearly appealing to different people. So you need to find that synergy where who you're trying to appeal to is who they're also trying to appeal to, because there you get the added value. And what we're all trying to do is keep our audience interested. So we're only going to push things that we think they'll be interested in. So if you're pushing something that actually is just really not for a BBC audience, then why would they do that? Because they care about their audience. So I think it's just always about just thinking where the actual natural synergy is and having lots of details, because people kind of get in touch and say, oh, you always put bad news on, this is a good news. It doesn't work like that. That's not how this works. And so you have to recognize that it needs to be something that's appealing to them and appealing to the people that watch.
I think that's a really good point. And I think in all the content, especially video content that we produce, it's important to be strategic and always ask yourself, why are you even producing this? Because it's so easy to just pick up a phone and record and forget actually what's the purpose of this? Why are we showing up on LinkedIn? Why are we showing up on these channels? And it's so important that, our purpose is clear, so that we're known for something, people get used to our narrative and it's resonating with that audience. So such an important point, So what are your kind of top live streaming tips?
I think I would always say, one, be prepared, like have the space around you prepared and yourself be prepared and yourself feel comfortable. I think sometimes because people don't like being on camera and they dread it, they just try and fly into it because they don't want to think about it before the moment arrives. And actually, that is a surefire way to dislike it even more, because it won't go the way that you want it to go. I think sometimes people go in, let's say, and it's a mess behind them, or they're wearing clothes they don't feel comfortable in, and actually that inhibits your performance, because if you are not comfortable, you are thinking about what other people are thinking about. And when you're thinking about that, you're not concentrated on your actual content. So I think it's about, one, making that space around you and yourself ready to go, and giving yourself time. So I will always, typically, like if I'm doing a webinar, I'll be sitting in the seat like half an hour before I start. And that is just a newsreader, probably kind of thing of being in the studio for rehearsal. But I will just be there, because then you can just be calm and you can think about what you're about to do. I think the other thing is to prepare content. And so sometimes people are like, I'm just going to go on and say something. You can, and I think there's times and spaces where you have enough passion or energy about a topic to just go on and start talking. But actually, much of the time, what you need is a thought through. It doesn't need to be every word, but some bullet points on what you want to talk about, what you think are the important things about that subject, and also how you're kind of going to end it, like how you're going to exit this live. Because I think a lot of people just kind of get on there, start rambling. It goes all these different places where you didn't mean for it to go. You start saying all the things that are not on message, and then it kind of just finishes in a puff of, oh, well, better just end that there then. And I think preparation is really important for making sure there's a flow and a theme that goes right through what you're talking about, and that you kind of finish on a good, strong note too.
Yeah, that's amazing. And actually, my next question was going to be, what are some total no-nos? And I think that's a nice one, because so often it is, we'll just grab a camera and we'll just kind of speak. But that's kind of something you would never, ever do in broadcast journalism, ever. And so, no, that's such an important point. I was watching one of your lives, or a video that you did the other day, and you raised a really, really good point I've never heard before. And it was like, you know, when you're interviewing people, or, you know, and they have a comment that you agree with, sometimes we say, like, I love that, or that's great. And you said something to the effect of adding value, like there's better things to say. Can you explain that? Because it was so powerful and so good. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so notorious for saying, I love that. Like, I need to listen to this and take note of that. But can you explain that? Because it was such a good point.
So I think someone somewhere, apologies to that person, has told someone that saying great question at the end of every question is a good idea. And it's not really. And it's not that you should never say it. I said you should never say it. And I don't think you should say it. But it's not that you should never say it if you genuinely think it's a great question. But actually, what people use it as, they use it as a thinking phrase. So because they're trying to think of the answer, they say great question whilst they're trying to gather their thoughts. But actually, it can come across really ungenuine, especially if it's after every single question. Because if we had a conversation, and for me, interviews are conversations. We're having a conversation now. So if we were having a normal conversation, let's take it off screen, and everything you said to me, oh, have you been out today? Great question. It would be strange. So make it not strange, because you're in an interview. Actually, it makes it stranger. And so I think, because it's more of a thinking phrase, so it's because you're trying to think of what to say next. And so I think it's better if people ask you a question, one, just to answer it. Even if you need to pause, although it feels like a long time to you, actually it's quicker than you think, because in your mind, any pause feels like an eternity. But actually, it's only a couple of seconds, and people don't mind that. And at least it seems like you're gathering yourself, and like you're thinking about what someone's just said. Because that's the other thing about just coming straight back with great question. Well, it's just so reactive. Like you couldn't possibly have absorbed a great question in that non-second. And so I think it's better if someone, and sometimes if it's a tough question, to kind of say, that's a challenging question. So I can answer it in two parts, or, that's really interesting. I've never thought about that before. Now that I think about it, this is what, and actually answer the question honestly. Saying great question is not honest, because some of the questions aren't great. They're actually just very run-of-the-mill and very average. And so the over-enthusiastic response to it is just kind of strange. So I think it's always about authenticity. It's always about being honest and responding in a way that actually shows you have listened to the question. rather than an off the bat answer that shows you haven't listened to the question, or that really you're just thinking about yourself, because that's sometimes how it can kind of come across. And it's completely unintentional, because I don't think people, I work in comms, so I think about these things in great depth, and most people are not thinking about them in great depth. But yeah, I just think answering a question authentically and honestly in the first instance is always best. And if you need to gather your thoughts for a couple of seconds, it is totally fine to have a couple of seconds of non-speaking. We don't have to fill every single gap with a word. But I think sometimes we feel like we do. So that's why we say that.
Yeah, and I love that point, because it's a simple point, but a really powerful point about giving yourself permission to slow down and pause, because lives by their very nature can be quite pressurized. And so there is that pressure to be like, okay, we have to keep the conversation moving, we have to say something. But actually giving yourself permission to be, actually, no, let's have a thoughtful conversation. Let's not speak about the audience for a minute, just for a minute, but think about the person that I'm speaking to and the best way I can respond to that. So that's such an important point. It's such a good point.
And if you respond to that person well, the audience gets more.
Yeah.
And I think this is what, the audience gets more value. Like you say, if you say, actually, I'm having a conversation, let me just pause, the connection all around gets so much better, because everyone's connecting with everybody, rather than these kind of what can sound like flippant answers. It actually breaks down connection rather than builds it. And what you want to do in any interview is you're trying to build connection.
So this kind of isn't a question I had pre-written down, but how do you deal with that pressure? Because people feel it on lives, but when you're on the BPC, ITV, ITN, and you're live, what are some tips for actually dealing with that pressure?
The thing is, it's really interesting, because you go through all this training before you ever go on a screen. And this is why I actually really feel for people who are just having to become TV presenters overnight because COVID's happened and the work's like, well, you just got to go on screen. Because actually, we did a lot of training. I watched myself back loads before I ever went on telly, and I watched myself back for a whole year afterwards. I think in terms of pressure, you go to a different place. So in the beginning, the pressure was different to what it is now. So when I first started doing it, the pressure was a lot. Like, you just feel like, I'm on the BBC. Oh my God. And I remember my first time live a few weeks after, my sister was like, oh, Janelle, like a rabbit in the headlights. And I did. You could literally see every time someone was speaking in my ear, like my visible reaction, because you just also knew. But then once you get into it, what you realize is, how I did it was, I'm talking to the camera. I'm talking to one person. I'm not trying to talk to loads of people. And I just didn't ever think about the people at home. And I know that sounds terrible and kind of counter to what I'm saying, but actually all the prep before is considering for the audience. When you go on, it's about performing. And so I don't know, you just take those nerves and channel it. And the thing is, I think a lot of people think nerves are bad. Nerves aren't always bad. Nerves keep you in a space of being on your watch about what you're doing. And the day when you just feel like, oh, I'm just going to breeze on and just read through it, I guarantee you will make lots of mistakes, because actually that's not the space. So I always say nerves are good, because they keep you tight and they keep you focused. So I never mind the nerves. I think obviously it's a problem if people are so nervous that they then can't speak or go. That's when nerves are different. But there are different ways you can channel those nerves. But yeah, I just very much concentrated on getting the content out, and I think the best way to channel it.
And I think that point that you made about focusing on the audience before, and then when you're on, that's about the performance, is so good, and a really valuable takeaway. Well, you have knowledge for days, as they say. on this topic. But one final question before we begin to wrap up. We've spoken a lot about bringing that professionalism and marrying it with the democracy that is social media, which I think is an important point. But to finish on something quite tangible, is there maybe a structure you would advise people to use for short form video content that you could share?
I think the best kind of structure that you always want to do in the video to make it impactful is tell people what you're going to tell them, tell them, and then you tell them what you just told them. And I think when you're doing short form video, it's very easy to, and it depends on where you're doing it, right? But people are joining all the way through. People don't watch the whole way.
Yeah.
So don't assume that they're going to get exactly what it is you're talking about from what you're saying. You know, you want to recap and say, this is what we're talking about today. If you've just joined, we're talking about this today.
Yeah.
What we've talked about today is, because that way you know that you've reinforced your message, and also it's a good reminder for you to make sure you stay on track, because then you don't lose your track if you're very much kind of tethered to a beginning, middle, and end. And you have to recap all you've just said. So I think it makes it easier for you, and it also makes it easier for the audience, because everyone's really clear about why you're doing this today. And I think where things get a bit tricky is when people are not clear about why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah,
then absolutely. It doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely. So if you have any questions, those of you that are watching, please pop them into the comments box now, and we will answer them for you. In the meantime, Janelle, where can people connect with you? How can people work with you if they want to? Yeah.
So you can connect with me on LinkedIn, which is great, which is how we connected, which is awesome.
Yeah.
You can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter, Instagram. I'm at Janelle Aldred everywhere. There's not many Janelle Aldreds in the world, funnily enough. So it's easy to always get my name handle. So I do video courses, which I'm currently pausing because they're getting accredited, which is excellent. An accreditation process, which means hopefully some of you, if you want to do it, your work can pay for it as part of your CPD. And so I do courses around video presentation, interviews and panel skills. I also do around getting organic press as well, and do coaching as well. So I work with execs, CEOs who want help with their messaging and kind of how to land it and the best way to kind of come across well. It is hard on video. Like, listen, I honestly, I do feel for people. I'm 13 years in, so it's fine for me. Like I know what I'm doing. I know how to maneuver myself. I know how to answer questions. I know how to not answer questions. I know how to do all of those things. But I get that for some people, especially in this blended model, it's really tricky when you're doing in real life and some video, doing lots of video. We're all being asked to be on more panels and everything else like that. So yeah, that's kind of what I do.
Amazing. So I hope you have found this helpful. In fact, I'm sure you all have, and that the tips on how to communicate like a pro on video have been useful to you. My whole purpose for doing these lives is to support you through the launch process. And I think video is such an important part of launching in the digital age that we're in, but I think it's important to do it well. Like I said, I straddle between the lines of, picking up a camera and just doing it and having that professional element. I think it's so important. And so I always want to bring people that can support the viewers through that launch process. And in terms of video and preparing to do video, they don't come any better than you, Janelle. So if you are wanting to do video, you're wanting to master video, you want to get better at video, please do connect with Janelle. You will be in amazing hands. So yes, Janelle, thank you so much for joining me. It's been so valuable, and I've even come away with some tips. So that has been phenomenal. So thank you so much. And like I said, please do connect with Janelle, and I'll be back with you on Wednesday. Have an amazing day and rest of the week. Speak to you soon. Oh, before we head off, I just want to thank those of you who have commented and joined live. Laurel, Brenda Lee, Denzel, Ayobami, thank you so much for your comments and joining us live, as well as those of you who will be watching the replay. So speak to you all soon. Bye bye.